You're listening to School Leadership Reimagined, episode number 31.
Welcome to the School Leadership Reimagined podcast, where we rethink what's possible to transform your school. If you're tired of settling for small wins and incremental improvement, then stay tuned to discover powerful and practical strategies for getting every teacher in your school moving towards excellence. Now, here's your host, Robin Jackson.
Hey, builders. Welcome to another episode of School Leadership Reimagined. I'm your host, Robin Jackson, and today we're going to talk about how to use data like a builder. But before we dive into data, I want to first read you an excerpt of an email that I got from a Builders Lab alumni just this week. So he was sending us a note to just say hi to the team because when you come to Builders Lab, you make a lot of connections. But then he said something really powerful. And so here's a paragraph I want to read for you. He said, "Getting to our real core values has been more powerful than I could have ever imagined. Just today, I met with a senior student in our outdoor ed class who was outside of the boundaries that we had set and not responding to teachers' efforts to change his pattern. My time at Builders Lab has equipped me to have a powerful and direct conversation that already impacted this student. And this is not isolated. It happens every day, and not just for me, but for my entire staff and my entire student body. You guys made a real and profound difference in our practice. Thank you for all you do." Isn't that awesome? I love getting emails like this. And quite frankly, I get emails like this all the time from people who have attended Builders Lab. I've gotten emails from principals whose schools were struggling and they came to Builders Lab and then they went back to their schools and they turned their schools around. So their schools went from the bottom of the pack to the top of the pack in just a few short months. I've heard from instructional coaches who are really struggling to get some of their more difficult teachers to improve. And then they come to Builders Lab, they learn about how to give teachers the right kind of feedback. They go back, they have those feedback conversations with teachers, and they have these major breakthroughs, even with teachers who they thought were lost causes. And I've heard from district leaders who bring their principals to Builders Lab, and then when they return to their districts, they don't just see improvement in just one school, they see improvement in multiple schools because the principals are applying what they learned in Builders Lab, and they're seeing these major improvements. In fact, it's one of the main reasons why we're offering multiple Builders Labs this summer, because we know this stuff works and we wanted to get as many people to be a part of this, to be able to go back and make these same changes to their school as possible. So when you come to Builders Lab, you're going to spend 3 days working intensively with me to overcome frustrations like feeling like you just don't have enough control over your time to focus on what matters most. So you're going to come to Builders Lab and you're going to get really laser focused on your core values and your vision and your mission. And so instead of constantly putting out fires and dealing with issues that are distracting everyone from the most important goals of the schools, you're going to actually be spending your time working on the things that are most important. You're going to learn how to do that at Builders Lab. When you come to Builders Lab, you're going to, maybe you're frustrated with teachers because they're not listening to you. They don't seem to understand what you're trying to ask them, or they don't follow through with what you're asking them to do. And maybe they're not taking as much ownership as you like over their own practice and the role that they play in student achievement. So you're going to come to Builders Lab and you're going to learn how to get people to take that ownership, to help people be accountable so that you're not frustrated when you're working with teachers. They're not blaming kids or the parents or even you for why they're not reaching their goals. Instead, they're rolling their sleeves up and they're working right alongside of you, trying to build something amazing for your students. So when you come to Builders Lab, you're going to overcome frustrations like failing student achievement. You're going to learn how to pinpoint why students are not achieving as much as you'd like, and then you're going to develop your own unique pathway to reaching those achievement goals. So if your growth has hit a ceiling, if you stopped growing, and no matter what you do, you can't seem to break through to get to that next level, or if you feel like nothing's working and you've tried a whole bunch of strategies and quick fixes and you're not seeing the results that you want, or you have people who are pushing back and standing in the way of what you really want to do with your school, you need to come to Builders Lab. So we've got two options for you this summer. The first is Builders Lab in Palm Springs, California, and that's happening June 24 through June 26th. And that's great for principals, assistant principals, district leaders, even instructional coaches. But we also have something special just for instructional coaches, and that's Builders Lab, the Coaches Edition. And that's designed to specifically address the unique needs of an instructional coach. So you'll get all the goodness of Builders Lab, but it'll be put in terms that really make sense to you as an instructional coach. And that's happening in the Washington, D.C. area on July 15 through 17. So right now, go to mindstepsinc.com/builders-lab so that you can get your tickets. We've already started selling tickets. People are registering in groups. We're not seeing a lot of people register one by one, although you're welcome to do that. We're seeing people register in groups, so we're probably going to sell out faster than usual because people are coming in groups to Builders Lab this summer. But if you go to mindstepsinc.com/builders-lab, you can get your tickets for either Builders Lab or Builders Lab, the Coaches Edition. And then you can get ready to discover how to get everybody in your school working towards these powerful core values, vision, and mission. Again, that's mindstepsinc.com/builders-lab. And I'll put a link in the show notes so that if you're driving and you can't write it down right now, you can get it later on. Okay, now let's talk about data. And, when I was thinking about preparing this, I thought about an experience. I don't know if I've ever told you this. Have I ever told you about my first introduction to data-driven instruction? And I'm using quotes here. I was a high school English teacher at the time, and we got a new principal. And you know how it is when you get a new principal. Everybody's really curious about who he or she is. And so when this new principal dropped by our English department meeting shortly after he arrived, I was kind of excited to meet him and to hear what he had to say and, hear his vision for our school. So, we were having our meeting. Our department chair was running the meeting, and she said, our principal's here today. And when it came time for him to talk, this is what he said. He said, look, I've only been here a few weeks, but I've had a chance to look at your data a bit. And then he pulls out this folder and he says, I've taken the liberty of compiling some simple data for you. And then he passes out these pie charts that show our grade distribution from our last progress reports. And after we pass everything out and we're looking at our pie charts, because we'd never seen our data like that, he goes, look, this is not good. What are you all going to do about this? And I remember being so shocked at his bluntness. And I also remember being very surprised at seeing my data because I hadn't ever seen it before. And I really felt kind of ambushed, and I started to feel really defensive. And so while he sat there and waited for us to deliver the solution and answers, he sat there kind of with his arms crossed across his chest. And I just looked at my data and it felt threatening. I felt threatened. Now, luckily, our department chair, kind of stammered out something about our needing time to process the data and that we get back to him after our next meeting. And he says, okay. And then he left. And we just sat there. We felt so blindsided and we felt angry and defensive. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was my first introduction to data. So when I hear the term data-driven instruction, or I hear people talking about, meeting weekly in data groups, I often wonder whether teachers feel about data the way that I used to feel about it, or maybe you feel that way about data too. I mean, have you ever gone to a district meeting and then been presented with your school data and then been told, fix it? Or maybe your supervisor has come to your school and hit you over the head with your data. And unfortunately, that's how data is often used. It's sort of this blunt instrument to beat people over the head and demand new results. And you know what else I've seen? I've also seen schools where all they do is talk about data, and they have charts and graphs and data roams, and it's data everywhere you go. And they can tell you to the minutest detail how every student is doing on every single standard and substandard and substandard. And they're constantly tracking data all the time. And so they have data walls and they have elaborate spreadsheets. They can look up every benchmark test score for every student in less than 3 seconds. And in these schools, data is king, and they take great pride in their data. They're not scared of data at all. They embrace the data. The trouble is that in a lot of cases, they're so obsessed with the data that they've lost sight of the kids. And they're so invested in moving the data that moving the data becomes the goal rather than helping kids learn and thrive. So I wanted to talk about data today because I think that we're at a point in our profession where we are on both extremes. We are either, using data to kind of beat people up about it and making data something very threatening, or we have totally embraced data, but data is now driving the work rather than the kids' needs driving the work. So I want to talk about how builders handle data, because builders don't run from data. They don't beat people up with data, but they don't become so data-driven that they lose sight of kids either. Now, I get it. I can get into all the innovative ways that builders use data, but today, what I want to do is just talk about some of the principles that drive how builders use data, because if you can understand these principles, you can make data way more meaningful and efficient in helping you serve your students. And look, I get it. When used the right way, data can be a really powerful tool. So I'm not going to go on an anti-data rant. But when you really think about it, data's neutral. It's really about what we do with data that makes it powerful. So today I want to talk about 3 ways that builders look at data differently than leaders, or even how they look at it differently than even bosses do. And the first thing that builders do when they're looking at data that's a little different is that they look at data in the context of their core values, mission, and vision. And one of the things that we do at Builders Lab is that we help you create this thing we call a builder's blueprint. And your builder's blueprint is it's like a roadmap that takes everything that you've learned in Builders Lab and shows you that how to figure out what your specific pathway is to achieving your goals once you leave Builders Lab. And the wonderful thing about the pathway is that instead of starting with data, your pathway to success always starts with your vision, your mission, and your core values. In fact, builders look at their vision, their mission, and their core values before they ever look at the data. So leaders do it the other way around. They look at data first, and they determine their goals and their mission and their vision based on what the data tells them that they are not doing. And frankly, that's a little backwards. I mean, the data shouldn't be driving your vision, mission, and core values. Your vision, mission, and core values should be driving what data you look at and how you use your data. You see, builders start with deciding who they are going to be as a school. They decide what their purpose is as a school and what promise they are planning on making to every student that they serve. That's their core values. That's their vision. That's their mission. And that's what drives the work, not the data. Then afterwards, after they've decided on their core values, their vision, and their mission, then builders look at data in order to determine whether or not they're living out their core values, whether or not their work is on mission, and whether or not they are achieving their vision. It's not that builders don't see data as important. It's just that vision, mission, and core values always come first. So let me illustrate the difference so that you can see how that actually works out in a very practical way. So here's how leaders look at data. They start by drilling down the data and looking at student performance data. And by the way, leaders look at student performance data almost to the exclusion of any other kind of data. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But they look at test scores and they see who's proficient or above and who's not proficient and who's on the bubble. And by the way, can we just stop calling them bubble kids? I hate that term. I really feel like it dehumanizes the kids and their needs. So can we just stop talking about that, please? Can we just agree as a profession that we will no longer use the term bubble kids? It is now a bad word, and every time you use it, you have to give somebody a dime or a dollar. Okay, I'm off my soapbox now. So anyway, what leaders do is that they drill down the data. They look at student performance data. They look at test scores. They see who's proficient and who's not proficient. They look to see where the district or the state says their scores should be. And then they set a goal to make up the difference between where they are and where somebody else says that they should be. And that's how we get school goals like, we will increase the number of students who are proficient in reading by 12.5% by 2021. Or we will increase the number of students who score at or above proficiency to 65% in math by 2020. And here's the problem with goals like that. Every single time you set a goal that doesn't include 100% of your students, you're planning for some of your students to fail, period. So when percentages or data sets determine your goals, it's pretty easy to set goals like this because you only see the number. You lose sight of the kids that those numbers represent. But here's how builders use data to determine their goals. They start the conversation by revisiting their core values, their mission, and their vision for their school. And they ask themselves, are we truly and consistently living out our core values every single day? Is the work that we're doing still true to our mission? How close are we to achieving our vision for 100% of our students? And in order to answer those questions, now they turn to data. And they don't look at the data first, they revisit their core values, vision, and mission first. The data will tell them how well they're living out their core values and where they're off the mark. The data will tell them whether or not they are doing work that's on mission or whether or not they're wasting time on work that isn't serving kids. The data is going to tell them whether or not they're keeping their promise to 100% of their students, which students are they not serving, and where are they falling short on their promise. In other words, the data is going to tell builders where their biggest constraint is that's getting in the way of their achieving their vision, that's getting in the way of their staying on mission, or that's getting in the way of their living out their core values every single day. And so after they've examined the data and determined where their biggest constraint is at that moment, builders then develop a 90-day plan to address the constraint. And the way that they monitor their progress is to monitor the data that revealed the constraint to begin with. So instead of goals like increasing the number of students who are proficient in reading by 12.579%, or getting the numbers who are proficient or above in math to 65%, builders use data to generate goals like this. So that we can better live out our core value of rigorous thinking, in the next 90 days, we will create rigorous unit plans so that every student in our school is engaged in rigorous acquisition, application, or assimilation every single day in every classroom so that they can develop more critical thinking skills. Okay, so that goal is inclusive of all your kids. It gives you a short time period so that you can focus, and it's connected to a core value. Here's another one. In order to achieve our mission of making this school a beacon in the community where students and parents feel invited and welcome, every teacher will have 3 meaningful interactions with every parent of every student they serve by the end of the semester. Here's another one. In order to reach our vision of 100% of our students reading on grade level by grade 2 and at or above grade level for each subsequent grade, in the next 90 days, we will increase our time on reading from 45 minutes per day to 1 hour and 15 minutes per day. Now, do you notice how each of these goals is anchored not in the data, but in a larger vision, mission, and core value for the school? It's really hard to be inspired by 25.5% or 65% that's going to be realized years from now. But a short 90-day goal anchored in your larger vision, mission, and core values, well, you can do something meaningful with that. And then you can track whether or not it actually makes a difference. And you don't have to wait for 2 or 3 years down the road to see if what you're doing is working. In 90 days, you should see some movement in the data. And if you don't, you have time to make adjustments so that you can start seeing that data move this school year. And here's the thing. When you anchor in your core values, vision, and mission, your data means something. It's not just test scores or percentages. It represents your vision for your students. It represents your core values as a school community. It represents your purpose and your mission for the work that you do. It's time that we stop looking at data in a way that reduces students to test scores or percentages and start looking at data in a way that truly reflects the most important aspects of the work that we do, which leads me to the second difference between the way builders and leaders look at data. Builders look at a variety of data, while leaders tend to focus almost exclusively on student performance data. And the problem is, student performance data only tells half the story. It tells you how students are doing on a small set of discrete skills, but it doesn't tell you how students are thriving in your school. I mean, builders are not satisfied with a few little data points on student performance because they know that that information only tells a small part of the story. For instance, student performance data could tell you things like, a certain number of your students aren't reading on grade level, but it's not going to tell you why they aren't reading on grade level. It could tell you a certain number of your students are not proficient in math, but it's not going to tell you what's preventing them from being proficient. I mean, student performance data could tell you that, a certain group of students are lagging behind the rest. But again, It won't tell you why. One of my mentors once told me that there were different stages of understanding. And the first and the lowest stage of understanding is data, because data is just numbers. You can look at the numbers and still not understand the numbers or the problem that the numbers are describing. And unfortunately, a lot of the training we get around data, it stops right there. So we get trained on how to look at the numbers, how to find the numbers. We know our numbers. We can tell you what percentage of our students are proficient or above. We can probably even break the data down a bit and tell you this number of ESL students or this number of Asian students are at or above proficient. But beyond that, we really don't understand what the numbers mean. So the first stage is of understanding is data. That's the lowest stage. The next stage of understanding is information. And that's when data is in a form that we can read it and we can understand it. And so that means that, we can organize the data in some way and we can create, data walls. And I'm not bashing data walls. I'm just saying that, if we just put data up on the wall and we don't use it to actually change kids' lives, then we're wasting the wall space. We can create these elaborate charts and graphs to help us see trends in our data. And again, it's helpful. We understand the numbers a little better, but we still don't know what to do about them. So lowest level is data. Second lowest level is information. The next highest level is knowledge. And that's when we look at data and we can start to determine cause and effect. And here is where most leaders really struggle, because leaders can look at data and even understand the trends a little bit, but a lot of times leaders don't know what to do about the data. They don't know why students are not proficient. They don't understand why certain groups of students are performing better or worse than other groups. So what leaders do is leaders make guesses. Leaders see that students are not reading at grade level and they go look for a reading program that will promise test score gains, or they see that students aren't proficient in math and, that their scores are trending down, but because they don't know why their scores are trending down, they make an educated guess. They choose a new math curriculum where they spend more time reviewing basic skills, or they include math intensives or interventions or remediations, and then they hope that everything that they've done will somehow impact scores, which, by the way, they don't even see until the end of the year anyway. So, you're playing a guessing game when you're a leader. But builders do it differently. So what builders do is when they look at the data, they look for cause and effect in the data. And in order to do that, they don't just look at student performance data. They look at a variety of data, because that variety of data can detect causality. And so they look at a lot of different kinds of data, and then they put that data in conversation with each other. So sure, they'll look at student performance data, but they put that data in conversation with something like school climate data. And I'm not just talking about those end of the year climate surveys either. They're looking at all kinds of climate data, like attendance data and suspension data, the number of students who are involved in extracurricular activities, student surveys, student focus groups, whatever it is. They're looking at a variety of data. And they're looking at parent data and teacher focus group data. And they're collecting all kinds of quantitative and qualitative data to round out and explain the picture a little bit more clearly. And then not only that, but builders look at observational data too, from how teachers are teaching in the classroom to how students are behaving in the halls and in the playground and in the lunchroom. Builders are paying attention to everything. And then, instead of looking at each data point in isolation, builders are looking at all the data together. For instance, one of my mentors was working with a school whose vision was to get every student at or above proficient in reading by the second grade. So they spent weeks poring over all of this student performance data, really trying to understand where students were in reading, how, they're looking at kindergarten data to figure out, okay, are these kids going to be ready by second grade? They're talking to parents, they're talking to students, they're looking at climate data. They're trying to determine how to improve reading. And what they figured out was that when students spent more time reading during the school day, they performed better on benchmark tests. So they started saying, okay, well, how do we increase the time students spend on reading? So they increased the reading block, and they still weren't seeing test score gains. And so what they did is they started using observational data on top of everything else, so they could figure out, what's going on with this extra time. Are we using it right? Is extra time really the thing we need? Should we be looking at something else? And so what they observed was this. So the school was in a place that was really, really, really cold, and the second grade classroom was on the other end of the building. And so after observing for just a couple of days, here's what the team noticed. In the morning, it would take students about 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes to get from the front of the building all the way to their second grade classroom and then undress in their snowsuits and their boots before they were ready for instruction. And then because it took so long, the teacher would stop teaching like 15 minutes before recess so that everybody could suit up, and then she could get everybody in a line, and then everybody could walk down the hall all the way back to the front door so they could go out for recess. And then after recess, you'd repeat the same thing over and over and over again, getting the kids lined up at the front door, getting them through the hallway, undressing from their snowsuits. And so they realized that the teachers were losing a significant amount of time each day that they could be spending on reading just because they were walking so far away from the front door. So guess what they did? They didn't buy a new reading program. They didn't ramp up benchmark testing, and they didn't grab any of the other quick fixes out there. The only thing they did was move the second grade classroom right next to the front door. So now no long walk. In the process, they bought on average an additional 30 to 40 minutes of reading time each day for students. And guess what? Scores went up. I'll tell you another story. So one of my first consulting clients was a school that was looking to increase their AP scores, and in particular, AP scores for students of color who were often underrepresented in honors and GT courses, and therefore they were underrepresented in AP courses, and they were also less prepared for AP courses. So we pored over their data. We looked at their grades, their PSAT scores, their benchmark test scores, and we're trying to figure out how to help them increase their passing rate on the AP test. The AP test is only given once a year, so we didn't have time to wait for these kids to fail the test and then learn something from it. So we were giving them mock AP tests, and we were seeing that their scores were pretty low, and we were trying to figure out how to help them. Well, one day I was observing an AP class while students were doing a practice AP test. They were doing practice problems. And I noticed that the students were not completing all the problems in the time allotted because many of them were getting stuck on one problem and then they weren't moving on. And so when we asked the students why they weren't just skipping the question and moving on, the students told us that they were afraid they would be penalized for skipping the question. Well, at that time, the AP test actually didn't penalize students for skipping questions, but they did penalize students for giving the wrong answer. So we went back and we taught students how to skip questions. We didn't ramp up the curriculum. We didn't do extra study sessions. We just practiced skipping questions in class as part of their warm-up. Guess what happened? Their benchmark scores went up. And we would have never figured that out if we had only been looking at student performance data. And I guess that's my point. That's why builders look at multiple sources of data. They don't just want to know the numbers or even the trends. Builders want to try to understand causality. And then, and this is what's most important, they want to, over time, develop the wisdom to be able to know which cause to work on and which cause and effect relationship is really important and which one isn't. And that way, they can make sure that their work is productive and they're actually seeing gains in the data over time. They're paying attention to the data that matters and multiple sources of data, and they're not wasting time poring over numbers that don't really matter. Now, there's one last difference between builders and leaders that I want to discuss today, and that's this. Builders look at leading indicators, and leaders focus on lagging indicators. Now, leading indicators are kind of like canaries in the coal mine. They tell you the first sign of trouble so that you can actually respond and address the issue before it's too late. Lagging indicators simply tell you what's already happened, but they don't give you any opportunity to do anything about it. For example, every spring, students take a battery of tests that tell you how well they're progressing in reading and math. Well, you don't usually get the test results until the end of the school year or maybe even the summer, so the best you can do is try to adjust things for next year and hope they make a difference on next year's scores. Those test scores are lagging indicators. They tell you something that's already happened. Leading indicators are different. They tell you something that is about to happen, so you still have time to fix it. For instance, benchmark testing can be used as a leading indicator. It can tell you where students are headed so that you can intervene early and get students on the right track. Formative assessments are leading indicators. They tell you which students are making progress, which ones not so much, so that you can intervene with struggling students before the summative assessment. But there are also other leading indicators that we're probably ignoring. For instance, is there a connection between your attendance data and student performance? Can you predict, based on your attendance data, how well kids are going to do on a particular test or how well kids are going to do in class? If you could, then you could start to see trends happening in your attendance data. And if you get more kids in school, you'll make a difference on their student performance. Or here's another one. Does your suspension data signal something deeper happening in your climate that needs to be nipped in the bud early? If you start seeing an uptick in suspensions, you really need to be getting into classrooms and seeing what's happening in classrooms, because usually there's a connection. And if you look at that leading indicator, you don't wait until things blow up in your face before you do something about it. Now, one of my favorite leading indicators is student focus groups. In fact, student focus groups are one of my favorite data sources altogether. So basically, student focus groups are when you meet with like 12 to 15 students and you ask them a few questions and they sit in that room and they spill all the tea. They tell you everything. So I'm not going to go into the exact steps on how to do a focus group right now. If you want me to cover that, let me know on LinkedIn and maybe I can do an episode specifically on how to conduct student focus groups because they're really, really powerful. But if you're not interested, I don't want to do an episode. So let me know on LinkedIn. And if if enough of you do that, I'll go ahead and do an episode on that. But suffice it to say this. Students tell you the real deal when you get in the room with them and do a focus group. They tell you what's really going on in the school. I mean, I've had students tell me that the reason they weren't doing their homework was because the textbook was too heavy to take home. A lot of these students were taking public transportation back and forth to school. So we changed the textbook and guess what? Homework completion increased and, students' grades increased. I've had students tell me that the reason that they weren't taking notes in class was because they didn't know how to take notes. I mean, this is something I found out not by doing an observation. Kids told me this. Guess what? We taught them how to take notes. Guess what else? Their performance increased in class. I've had students tell me that, things about teachers. They've told me things like teachers are spending way more time on their phones than they are on teaching. And unfortunately, this is something I would not have known if it weren't for the student focus groups, because when we went into classrooms and did observations, the teachers would perk up as soon as we walked in the classroom. But the kids were telling me that as soon as you leave, they go back to being on their phones. So we addressed the issue with the teachers, and guess what? Student performance improved, classroom behavior improved, student satisfaction improved. And I found that out not just by looking at the numbers. I found that out in a subsequent focus group where students said teachers are doing better. I mean, I've had students tell me that teachers were phoning it in each day and they weren't planning. So we instituted common planning times and we gave teachers rigorous planning units templates that they had to follow until they could show us that they were planning more thoughtfully. And guess what? Teaching improved, student achievement improved, discipline improved, the amount of trash that was in the hallways improved. In fact, that's another canary in the coal. That's another leading indicator. If I see a whole bunch of trash in the halls, that tells me that your kids are more in the hallways than they are in classrooms. That tells me that the kids are not going to be performing well. When you change things in the classroom, this is my personal observation. You see less trash in the hallways. So that can be another leading indicator. I mean, leading indicators are all around you, and they can alert you to things like bullying issues that are brewing under the surface so that you can take care of them before they become an epidemic, or they give you the heads up on safety issues before they become before your school becomes a headline in the news. I mean, I could go on and on and on. I mean, the point is, pay attention to the leading indicators in your school so that you have a chance to catch and fix things before they become serious problems. And we're not just talking about grades here. Leading indicators tell you a lot of things, like things around your climate, things about your student or staff satisfaction, things about parents' issues. So you need to pay attention to those leading indicators because there isn't much you can do after the fact. But if you pay attention to your leading indicators, you actually have a chance to intervene early and improve your outcomes for students. And I suppose that's the main difference between the way builders and leaders use data. Leaders look at data first. They look at a limited number of data, and that data is mostly focused on lagging indicators instead of leading indicators. Unfortunately, that puts you in the position of always reacting to problems that come up rather than proactively preventing problems in the first place. Builders, on the other hand, they lead with their core values, their mission, their vision. They don't let the data dictate what they should or should not be doing each year. They set their course and they use the data to help them reach their goals. So builders look at a variety of data. They go beyond just looking at student performance data, although that's important. They also look at climate data and observational data to round out the picture and make sure that they're working on the right things to help them reach their goals. And builders look at leading indicators instead of lagging indicators so that they can get out ahead of the problems. They can nip them in the bud. They're not in a position of always reacting. They're being very proactive, and they can deal with stuff before it has a chance to hurt student performance or wreak havoc on their school culture. And remember what my mentor told me about the levels of understanding? The first level, the lowest level, is you start with data, but just having the numbers is not enough. So then you move to information, which means that you're reading the data and you're noticing trends, but even that's not enough. So you move to knowledge, which means understanding the cause and effect relationship among the data so that you can really focus your work on the right things instead of wasting your time working on things that won't affect student outcomes. But even that's not enough because there's another level to which builders aspire, and that's the level of wisdom. Wisdom is where you can look at the cause and effect relationships and determine which cause is the most important to work on first. Which cause, if you fix it, will have the greatest effect on your students. And this is where builders really shine and excel because builders are driven not by data, but by their core values, their mission, their vision. And because of that, they can stay laser focused on doing the right work. And they don't get distracted by things that, show up in the data, but really don't make a difference for their students. You see, when you let data drive your work instead of allowing data to inform your work, you're a slave to the numbers. But when you let your vision and your mission and your core values drive your work, data becomes this really powerful tool that helps you stay focused, that helps you track your progress, and that ultimately helps you remain on course and realize huge, important, meaningful gains for your students. Core values, vision, and mission first. Data second. That's how you use data like a builder. Now, before we go, don't forget to get your ticket to Builders Lab. If you want to find out how to get your people on board and moving so that you can have a successful school year next year, even the resistant people, the naysayers, or the people who are just plain stuck, then you really, really need to come to Builders Lab. Just go to mindstepsinc.com/builders-lab. That's mindstepsinc.com/builders-lab and get your ticket right now. And, let's make sure that we're connected on LinkedIn, okay? So what I want you to do is I want you to find me at Robin Jackson. I'm with MindSteps, and let's connect. That's the way we can keep the party going long after the show is over, and you can share feedback and ask questions that can potentially be future episodes of School Leadership Reimagined. So again, I'm Robin Jackson, and I'm on LinkedIn. Also, I would love to know what you think about the podcast. So would you please go to iTunes and leave me an honest review? Not only would it give me really helpful and useful feedback as I'm developing new shows, it will help other people find the show as well so that we can spread the love and build this tribe of builders that we are trying to create. And speaking of finding this podcast, if you've been served by this podcast, if this episode was helpful to you, would you please, please, please share this podcast with somebody else? I would count it as a personal favor because we really want to get the word out and build our tribe of builders. All right, ready to talk about next week? So next week, originally my plan was to talk about procrastination. But in an ironic twist, I'm going to have to put that topic off for another episode. And that's because I just got back from the ASCD annual conference, and it's a huge conference. If you've never been, you should really try to check it out. And I noticed something really interesting about the way that people were engaging in the content. And I don't know, it kind of gave me pause. So Instead of talking about procrastination, I promise I will, because it's a powerful tool in the builder's toolbox. But instead of doing that next week, I'm going to put it off, and I want to talk instead about how to engage in professional development like a builder. I've got some really interesting things to say about that, so I hope you'll tune in next time where we're going to talk about how to engage in professional development like a builder.
Thank you for listening to the School Leadership Reimagined podcast. For show notes and free downloads, visit schoolleadershipreimagined.com. School Leadership Reimagined is brought to you by MindSteps, Inc., where we build master teachers.